Good morning. Now I have to remember my English. I'll speak up. I'll warm up and I'll speak up. It's okay. I'm happy to be here. And we're going to talk about the king, the Jewish king, and the problems with the Jewish king, which will ring with the issues of the importance of modern democracies, and in my opinion, why the Torah was so skeptical about kingship, which ultimately failed, and why one can claim that the seeds of modern democracy began with our tradition. If only what is written in the American Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. That notion that all men were created in God's image, and therefore all men were created equal, is a Jewish idea, which of course was developed by Jefferson and Madison and before that the English political thinkers. But I want to go back to our sources. So I asked people to have Tanachim. We'll read a little bit in Hebrew. I'll try to translate into English. I'm starting with Sefer Dvarim, Deuteronomy, verse 17. Sefer Dvarim, Perek Yud Zayin. Try to listen to the ambiguity of the psukim. Okay? Sometimes the Torah says things which are simple. Sometimes the Torah says things which are complex. Okay? Anochi Hashem Elohecha is simple. Shamor et Yom HaShabbat L'Kodsho is simple. Kabed et Avicha v'et Imecha is simple. But sometimes the text is very complex. The Torah is a very, very brilliant and sophisticated and deep and multi-layered text. Let's try to listen to the different layers of the text. Ki tavo al haaretz asher Hashem Elohecha noten lecha v'yirishta v'yashavta ba v'amarta asima alai melech kechol hagoyim asher svivotai. I'm in Sefer Dvarim, Perek Yud Zayin, Pasuk. 14. Yeah, I'll try.
What's the book?
Deuteronomy.
Oh, Deuteronomy. Okay.
Okay, 17.
17.
Which verse?
14.
14. Verse 14.
All right.
You will come to the land, and you will sit in the land, and you will say, let's reign a king upon us like the nations which are around us. This is the way the Torah starts, with the commandment, or perhaps not the commandment, to ordain a king. Why is this pasuk ambiguous?
We're not supposed to go b'chukotehem.
First of all, we're not supposed to go b'chukotehem. When the Torah says, "V'amarta asim alai melech kechol hagoyim," I want a king to reign upon us like the Gentiles. Sefer Dvarim, the book of Deuteronomy, is all about not doing what the Gentiles do, right? We're coming to a land in which is idol worshipping, in which is Gilui Arayot. And the Torah is saying, do not learn from the ways of the Goyim. And the Torah starts the story of kingship with the people coming and saying, we want a king like the Gentiles. And why is this text so different, son? Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemor. Why? Most of our mitzvot come with a commandment, right? Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemor, daber el bnei Yisrael v'amarta alem v'asu lahem tzitzit. God spoke to Moses and commanded us. What does it say here? If you come and ask for it, v'amarta asima alai melech, you're asking for the king. It's completely different from the regular opening of mitzvot. And then it says, Sam tasim alecha melech. In fact, you can ordain a king. Asher yivchar Hashem Elohecha, which God your Lord will choose. Mikerev achecha tasim alecha melech. Lo tuchal letel lecha ish nochi asher lo achicha hu. It's forbidden to take a Gentile to be your king. It has to be one of you. And now let's listen to the next verse. Rak lo yarbe lo susim. But he should not have too many horses. Horses, if we translate it today, fast cars, Mercedes, beautiful houses. Rak lo yarbe lo susim. V'lo yashiv et ha-mitzrayma. V'lo yarbe lo nashim. And he's not to have too many women, too many wives. And of course, when we hear this verse, we already fast forward towards who?
Solomon.
Towards Solomon, who had many wives, and many of them were Gentile. And his heart was turned. And we know the disaster of his children, right? Shlomo's children. His heart. He started as a perfect king, but it turned into a disaster, and then the Jewish kingdom is actually split with Rechavam and Yeravam under his children. He wasn't able to pass whatever good things he had to his children. No horses, or no fleet of cars. Women is the same issue as today. Lo yarbe lo nashim, I mean, for those who are following the court case in New York. V'lo yasur levavo. The kesef v'zahav lo yarbe lo, and he's not allowed to have too much money. V'hakishivto al kiseh mamlachto, and when he sits on his chair, on his shrine, v'katav lo et mishnei Torah zot. There's a mitzvah for every Jew to write a Sefer Torah. But the king has a separate mitzvah to write a Sefer Torah for himself. כתב את ספר התורה הזה על ספר מלפני הכהנים הלוויים, והייתה עמו וקרא בו כל ימי חייו. The Kohen had to have the Sefer Torah in his pocket, and he had to walk to wherever he went with the Sefer Torah. And he had to read it. The Melech. The Melech. And then it says, Levilti sur, before that, Levilti rum levavo. How would we translate Levilti rum levavo? So his heart doesn't rise. He doesn't become arrogant. What? Hardiness. Haughtiness. Ulevilti sur min ha-mitzvah yamin u'smol. And so he doesn't deviate from the mitzvot of the Torah. So basically, after the Torah, the text here in Deuteronomy is predicting that they're going to ask for a king. The Torah says you can have a king. And then it seems as if the text is incomplete. How would we define, after the Torah says, okay, you can have a king, how would we define the many psukim after that?
But be careful.
Limitations on his power.
Limitations on his power.
The first four books of the Torah are from the Mala. Here, Torah was written, how I understood it, from down here. How the great Jewish leaders were able to introduce some of these things that seem to be either more or different than what you see in the first four Prakim of Torah.
The first four books.
Yeah.
So that's an important point. And
the people were deciding rather than Hashem. People deciding to accept what Hashem was.
It's very, what you're saying is very complex. And what is the status of Sefer Dvarim, Deuteronomy? We have the first four books. I mean, traditionally we tend to look at them as one unit. But the Tzidkat HaTzadik from Reb Tzadok HaKohen from Lublin says something very interesting, and that might be that what you're aiming at. Reb Tzadok HaKohen Lublin says that Sefer Dvarim is the beginning of Torah Sheba'al Peh. It's not. It's Moshe interpreting, and that's how we can explain perhaps the differences between the Sefer, the the Ten Commandments in Sefer Shemot and the Ten Commandments in Sefer Dvarim. But let's not get into that. But it's clear that there's something very worldly here. There's something new here. But as far as what?
It's practical.
It's practical, but I think there's a more powerful word. You said limitations, which is very important. The Torah is in deep panic. The Torah is in deep panic. They say, you want a king? Take a king. But. And yes, have the Sefer Torah because we are so fearful that bad things are going to happen.
Rabbi, in the spirit of the buts,
Yeah.
there were prophets concurrent with Shlomo, right?
Right.
Prophets concurrent with Shlomo. Did the prophets warn him about these things?
Okay, so that's a great question, and we're just going to get into that in a second. It's not only the prophets; I think it's God Himself who's very upset with this institution. And of course, what based on what you said, I always have in the back of my head what Lord Acton, the great British historian and politician, said, that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's clear they're saying absolute power. Now we're talking about thousands of years ago, right? This text was given or written thousands of years ago, when kings had completely absolute power, right? This is a time for the paros. I'm not talking about later about the Greek and the Roman kings and rulers who had completely absolute power. The Torah knows what absolute power means, and the Torah is saying we are going to limit this power because people who have complete power always tend to fall into the trap. They might start idealistically, but there's something about power that seeps into your personality and ultimately destroys you. Nobody has complete power and is not destroyed by that power. Now, I'll go to this gentleman's comment. Open the book of Samuel 1, the 8th chapter. And it's almost as if the text is saying what you were mentioning. 8th chapter.
Can I just ask one question?
Yes, sir.
Would the problem be different or be obviated altogether if they just assume that we want a king, not Chol HaGoyim? What if we learned how to have a king?
Okay, so
it's our unique way of having a king. I'm referring, it's just, as of course Shmuel makes that case. What? You said you want to be like everyone else?
No, well, it's even worse.
You have a king already.
I think I don't know what will be in the future. I think that in the past it just doesn't work.
Any kind of king.
That means again we'll go that. I'll show you a very interesting disagreement amongst the rabbis in the Talmud. If in fact there is a mitzvah to have a king or not, and we, Jewish tradition, and that's the Rambam, we say that there is a mitzvah to have a king. But I just want to show how problematic it is, and when people want absolute rulers, it always ends in disaster. Let's go to Sefer Shmuel. Vayikasher zaken Shmuel. Shmuel was old. Vayasem et banav shoftim liYisrael. And his children became judges. He nominated them as judges. Vayishem no abachor Yoel v'shem ishno Aviyah shoftim beBe'er Sheva. Lo alchu banav v'drachav v'yatu achrei abatza v'yikchu shochad v'yatu mishpat. His children did not go in his justice path, and they were corrupt. ויקבצו כל זקני ישראל ויבואו אל שמואל הרמתה. The elderly came to Shmuel ואמרו אליו, הנה אתה זקנת, you are now aged. ובניך לא הלכו בדרכיך, and your children have corrupted. אתה שימה לנו מלך לשופטנו ככל הגויים. Bring us a king to reign upon us like all the Gentiles, which is almost adapting the verse in Deuteronomy. כן? עשית עלי מלך ככל הגויים. Like the Gentiles. וירע הדבר בעיני שמואל כאשר אמרו תנו לנו מלך לשופטנו. He was very upset. ויתפלל שמואל אל השם, and then he prays to Hashem, and he's waiting for some kind of prophecy.
It's interesting, it doesn't say Lishloch, it says Lishpot, which is a difference.
It says here ככל הגויים, it says שופטנו ככל הגויים, also in Shmuel.
But he doesn't answer it. He seems angry Lishofteinu.
That's true.
He doesn't even focus on it.
That's true. That's true. But he's very upset. I think saying L'shoftenu is that's a very interesting comment. But see how God reacts to it. So Shmuel is upset. First of all, he's probably upset with his kids, right? His kids really messed up. So he's upset with his kids with that, and that's what triggers. I presume that people are feeling that civil society is disintegrating. We used to have Shmuel. He used to judge and rule us in a very positive way, and now they're very upset because his sons are corrupt, and I guess they feel, our society is disintegrating. We need someone to lead us, so let's ask for a king, because that's what people did then. And he's very upset about it. ויאמר השם אל שמואל שמע בכל העם לכל אשר יאמרו אליך כי לא אותך מעשו כי אותי מעשו ממלוך עליהם. Hashem says, you're upset? I'm upset. I'm upset. It's not that they don't want you, they don't want me. If they want a king, it means they're not interested in my kingdom, they're not interested in my malchut, they're not interested in being loyal to me. And then then God explains why he's so upset with them, and ultimately he says, okay, they asked for a king, they're going to get a king. Now, there are two issues here, and I'm going to talk about both of them. One issue is the problem of corruption and absolute power, which leads to absolute corruption. And the other issue is, I guess, somewhat more of what happens when there's a human being who is your king, and what does it do to your relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And it's very interesting with God. After Parashat Yitro, after we get the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, we start Parashat Mishpatim. We start to talk about the different laws. These are the laws which, according to our tradition, Hashem gave to Moshe and Har Sinai. כי תקנה עבד עברי 6 שנים יעבוד ובשביעית יצא לחופשי חינם. The first mitzvah in Parashat Mishpatim tells us that yes, there is an institution which is called slavery. But de facto, the Torah is trying to break up this institution. It's trying to break up this institution, and it says, okay, you can have slaves. But in the 7th year, every slave is free. Now, I think the Torah couldn't go so far as to say, I'm abolishing the institution of slavery, because the Torah couldn't go in too big a step. For instance, in Deuteronomy we have the parasha Veshet Yifator. It says that if you, I teach this to seniors before they go into the army, it talks about the legal right to take a non-Jewish woman during war. So when I teach this to seniors, I tell them, first of all, you all have to know this is completely irrelevant to your lives. If you touch any Palestinian woman, not only are you doing something terrible, but you also sit in jail if you're caught. But the Torah says that if you go into a battle zone and you see a beautiful Gentile woman, you can take her. You can marry her. Of course the Torah doesn't want you to marry a Gentile woman, because we know that all of Sefer Dvarim, all of Deuteronomy is about not taking Gentile women, especially without a decent conversion. But the Torah is part of a certain culture. What was accepted in that culture is that women who were on the defeated side were raped and either killed or raped and sold into slavery. That was what is accepted. I don't like to say this. This is what the Russians did after they came to Germany after World War II. I'm only mentioning it because there happens to be so much historical evidence about it. It's obvious that this is what happens between the Hutsis and the Tutsis in Africa. So what is the Torah saying? The Torah says you can take this woman, velakachta lecha liisha, but you have to marry her. You cannot rape her. Umachol lo timkerena bekasef, and you cannot sell her. And if you don't want her afterwards, you have to give her a decent divorce. Now, of course, the Torah doesn't want this, and Chazal themselves say that this is a terrible thing. Chazal are upset with this mitzvah. They say, if you take this woman, you should know at the end you're going to hate her, and you're going to have a ben sorer or moreh. Your children, it's going to be disaster with the children. Because someone who marries for lust and not for love, this is what happens. But the Torah is saying, under those circumstances, under those norms of war of 4,000 years ago, we're going to try to improve it. And you cannot rape. You want her, take her, but you have to marry her, and you have to marry her decently. The same thing is happening here. It's clear that the Torah does not want slavery. The Torah doesn't like slaves. The Torah is saying, okay, I can't tell you right when you came out of Egypt there are going to be no more slaves in the world. But we're going to have a different form of slavery. 6 years they'll be slaves, and then the 7th year they're free. Yes, you want to say something?
I'm going to say that all of the examples that I see, they're not a king as choice, but then there's a God that we don't see and we don't feel and we don't touch. And not all human beings can deal with that. So there is an accommodation. The word that I would use to describe all these instances is accommodation. However, in many cases, the accommodation isn't enough, and then it goes into discrimination.
I think that word is a very important word. The Torah is very practical. It accommodates.
That's how
that's not the topic of my shiur, but it's such an important point. You know, if you look at Genesis 1 and 2, people are forbidden to eat meat. Only after Noah are they allowed to eat meat. It's sort of a compromise of God. According to the Rambam, the whole notion of sacrificing Beit HaMikdash is an accommodation. To say that you can take a Gentile woman during war is a terrible accommodation, and thank God it doesn't happen in our army, or it almost never happens in our army. So, in a way, the Torah is very practical. It tries to accommodate certain situations, and it also leaves leeway to change those accommodations when needed. Now, what is the problem? So the Torah says the slaves are freed after the 7th year, and then it says, now, of course, slavery is terrible, so the owner of the slave would be able to give him a female slave, and the children would become the owner became the owner of the children, and then in the 6th year, if the slave says, "Ahavti et adoni et ishti v'et banai," I like this arrangement. It worked out for me. I have a wife, I have children. I don't want to become free. The Torah says, "V'gisho Adonav el Elohim, v'gisho ladet olam zuzah, v'ratzah Adonav et oznot v'martzeh, v'avado l'olam." There's this process in which they make this hole in his ear, and then he becomes an Eved Olam. Then he can stay with his owner if he likes the arrangement, because he doesn't want to leave his wife and his children. Of course, it's extremely cruel. The whole situation is extremely cruel, and that's why we abolished that institution. But Chazal say something very interesting. It's a sort of a bizarre act of piercing the ear of the slave who should have been discharged, and he wants to stay there, and they make the sign to prove that he agreed to stay with his owner. And Rashi already brings this very interesting midrash. Why do we go to the door, put the ear on the door and make a hole to prove that this person, to make a sign that this person is going to stay with his owner? Why the deletum zuzah? Why do we do it on the door? So the rabbis say as following. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, this is what God is claiming. Deletum zuzah shayu edim b'mitzrayim shepasachti al hamashkof al shtei mezuzot. This is where the Jews spilt the blood during the Makat Bechorot, during the killing of the firstborn in Egypt. Shepasachti al hamashkof al shtei mezuzot v'amarti, and I said, Hashem is saying, Ki li bnei Yisrael avadim, you will be my slaves, you will not be slaves to Paro. Avadaihem, you're committed to me. V'lo avadim la'avadim. V'alach zeh, and this man went, v'kanan, he brought an adon la'atzmo, he brought a new master. Yiratza b'fneihem. This is the way of God saying that he disapproves of this act. He's saying, you remember, I redeemed you from Egypt to be my slave, to be committed to me. And now you're taking another owner, you're taking another man. You already had Paro, I redeemed you so that you should not be a slave of a human being. The only worthy slavery is to be a slave of a Kadosh Baruch Hu, to be committed to a Kadosh Baruch Hu. That's something which is worthy. And it's the way of, according to Chazal, the way that the Torah is saying that we're very, very unhappy about this institution of slavery. We're so upset with the fact that you want to be a slave. We're going to remind you why I took you out of Egypt. I took you out of Egypt so that you become committed to me. Now that's exactly God's response to Shmuel. He's saying they want a king. They want a king. They want that accommodation. They need that accommodation. But Hashem is saying the second you're subservient to a human being, it means you cannot be subservient to me. There's this notion of ultimate freedom, that people cannot be enslaved to other people. Now I want to talk about the accommodation because I think it's a very important. Yes, sir.
Just one thing again, quickly. The United States, I was born in America, and the United States started with the idea of democracy. But until the 60s, the black Negro, as it was called then, was still basically not totally a slave, but was certainly not an equal partner to anybody who was from the rest of the white world. And so we see this. We could see it. Okay, this was thousands of years ago when the Torah was written. But now in America, post World War II, that was able to break away from European stuff even. They still took a long time. I'm sure you remember it too. Giving the black population, the Negroes they call them, the equal quality to even vote.
Right.
So it's a,
So first,
so on the one hand, it shows how far ahead they were. On the other hand, it shows some dilemma about the American democracy and the liberty belt that you have in Yom HaTzmaut. I walk up there. I walk by it every time and I see what's written on it. That was the ideal, but it took a long time for that to be a total ideal.
okay. So let me comment, and then I'll go back to what you. America is very interesting, especially for Jews, because America was phenomenal for Jews. America was phenomenal for Jews. People came penniless. People came from these very strong anti-Semitic Eastern European countries. I'm not saying that there was not anti-Semitism in America, but it was nothing compared to the anti-Semitism in Europe. And as a child, even as a grown-up, my father insisted, even when we were here, that we celebrate Thanksgiving because we have what to thank the United States of America for. But America was born in this internal hypocrisy. Because if you were black, things were terrible in the United States. I'm even talking, of course, we're talking after the Civil War. Anybody who read the history of the blacks in America, America, which, the internal contradiction was so terrible. In the Declaration of Independence, they say all men are created equal, and then they would bring these slave families. If they survived the journey, they would sell them on the block in Virginia, and they would send the mother to one place and the father to another place, and the children to a third place. It was just terrible. Not to talk about the abuse and the sexual... slavery was just terrible. But even after the Civil War, things were terrible. And I'll just end my comment with the fact that, in a way, many of the blacks in America sort of read these stories of Exodus, and they really dreamt that they'd have a Moses who would lead them out of Egypt land, because they were in Egypt land in the United States. And I think things have changed. My father used to teach high school in New York before he moved here, and I'm sure most of you saw the movie Mississippi Burning, which is a worthwhile and terrible movie. Goodman, one of the two white boys, was a student of his in 12th grade in a very good private school in New York City, and my father was very close with him. And then he went down to the South, and and the KKK blew him up. So I still think that American democracy is amazing, and I still think that the stain on what was done to African Americans and to the Indians, the stain is tremendous. And that's the way things are. But yes.
I won't take too much.
Yeah.
So I just want to make two good points with what I said already. I think when you use the term slave to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, it's a completely different concept than avadim in the context of Hakol Tzafui V'Hashu Ukna, and also avadim hayu ata b'nei chalim doesn't mean.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So that it's a very important comment also. I think the notion of freedom and the reason we had to leave Egypt is that you have to be free in order to choose to be a slave of God. You have to be free. It's an act of choice. Nobody's absolutely free, okay? We're all the fact that we were born with certain genes and the fact that we were born in a certain society. Nobody is really completely free. I think the important thing is for people to choose to what they want to be committed. And the fact that we were free to accept the Torah and Har Sinai, I think that's the essence of freedom. this nihilistic freedom where I get up in the morning, I do whatever I want, we know that's a joke, right? Even high school kids don't believe in it. There's no such thing as being completely free. Nobody's completely free. But the fact that we have political and we believe in free will as part of our theology means that we have the ability to choose something which I think is worthwhile. Okay? I mean, I always, since I married many of the graduates in the school, I tell them, when you get married out of free will, you're making a choice to be committed. To be committed is not a dirty word. To be committed to your wife, even if she's not as beautiful as she was under the chuppah, that's part of being a mature adult. To be committed to your husband, even if he's not as handsome as he was under the chuppah, that's being committed, and that's the way mature people, people who constantly, part of the problem with our modern society is that everything is completely changing, and people don't hold those commitments, but now I'm really not talking about what I was supposed to talk, so I'll go back to it. How much time do I have? When am I? Okay. Let's go back. Now, it's very interesting that in the Talmud in Masechet Sanhedrin, which talks about the issue of the king, there are two opinions of the Tanaim. Tanaim are the Tanaite sages who wrote the Mishnah or quoted in the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda says, Gimel mitzvot nitztavu Yisrael v'knisatan la'aretz. There were 3 mitzvot which they were commanded when they came to Israel. To set a king, to lachit zaro shel Amalek, to eradicate Amalek, and to build the Bet Mikdash. So in fact, when we take this complex verse where it says, Amarta asima alai melech kechol hagoyim, som tasim alecha melech, which is really a contradiction because you're asking to have a king, and then Hashem commands, som tasim alecha melech, you should in fact have a king. Rav Yehuda said there's a mitzvah to have a king. Rabbi Yonorai, who's Rabbi Meir, says, לא נאמרה זו אלא כנגד תמרותן שנאמר ואמרת אשים עלי מלך. Rabbi Yonorai says Hashem is only responding to their wish. It is permissible, but it's not a mitzvah. That means there are 2 opinions of the Tanaim. 2 Tanaim read our verse in Deuteronomy 17. One says Hashem is commanding to have a king, and Rabbi Norai says he's allowing us to have a king, but in fact we don't have to do it. We don't have to have a king. I personally identify with Rabbi Norai because the text is so inhibiting afterwards. The text is so scared of this institution. The text is panicked of all the terrible things that the king can do. And Rabbi Norai says that you don't have to put up a king, except that halacha is the Rambam in this instance. And the Rambam said there is a mitzvah to have a king, and in fact we do have the tradition. We have the tradition of the kings. But what's interesting is that there's a Mishnah. Maybe I should have given some text, but I'll just I didn't know there'd be so many people here. I thought we just saw like a couple of people around the table. So
it's very good.
Thank you. The Mishnah says as following in Sanhedrin. The Mishnah says, "Hamelech lo dan v'lo danim oto." The king should not be a member of a court, and he cannot be judged. That means he is above the law. That's what the Mishnah in Sanhedrin says.
Trump's favorite Mishnah.
Exactly, Trump's favorite Mishnah. But listen to the Amoraim. One of the Amoraim comes into Talmud and says, no, Amar Rav Yosef lo shanu al malchei Yisrael. This Mishnah only relates to the kings of Israel. We know that we don't have kings of Israel anymore, right? Because the Ashurim sent them to exile, and what we are left from the kingdom of David. So Rav Yosef, one of the Amoraim, says, no, the Mishnah is only referring to Malchei Yisrael. Aval Malchei Beit David, with the kings of David, Dan v'danim oto, they are not above the law. Even the king can be judged. Dichtiv, and he quotes a verse from Jeremiah. Beit David, Jeremiah is reprimanding the kingdom of Beit David, and he's saying, Dinu lavoker lemishpat. You are not doing your role as judges. And we know that the major role of the Jewish king is to judge. By the way, that's the reason HaKadosh Baruch Hu picks Avraham Avinu. In Lech Lecha, we don't know why Hashem picked Avraham Avinu. He just says, go to Canaan. Only later on it says, Ki yida'ativ leman asher yitzavel banav acharav v'shamru derech Hashem la'asot tzedakah u'mishpat. I'm picking Avraham because I know his way will be a way of judgment. Judgment in the sense of true judgment. And that's the job of the Melech HaMashiach. The Melech HaMashiach has to create a just system in which the poor and the widows and the orphans are not abused. So Rav Yosef says, no, what the Mishnah is talking about is only Malchei Yisrael, but Malchei Beit David, of course they have to be judged. Why? And if they have to judge, and that's what Yirmiyahu is asking them to do, then of course they have to be able to be judged for someone who cannot be judged. Someone who is above the law cannot judge someone else. Someone who is not part of the system, of course, can't judge someone else. Now we're talking very early. We're talking about, the beginning of the Middle Ages that this Amorah Rav Yosef lived. Now we know that kings were always above the law. Kings were always the law. If the king decided that someone is to be killed, he would be killed. If the king decided that that the law in the land would be this or that, that's what would happen. And the Torah is saying that the Jewish kings cannot be above the law. They definitely cannot be above the law of the Torah. And we know that the story in with the evil king Achav, who took the field of Navot Israeli, and it became a tremendous crime because he took the field of someone who didn't want to sell it to him. So
they have a concept today, it's called condemnation, where the government, at least in America or in the various states, can take over land. In fact, the court ruled valid where a government took over the land and then sold it to developers.
Listen, I understand that there are laws of condemnation, but the big difference is that the government, when it takes land for condemnation, the law is that they have to take it for public use. That means we want to build a rail in Jerusalem. I'm sure they're condemning part of the land. They're taking part of people's gardens. But that's for the public use, and a government has to use its power for the will of the majority of people, or whoever it is. What happened with Achav is that he was taking the land for his private use. He's saying the land for his private use. That means that's called corruption. And even when there's condemnation, I understand people can go to the courts and they can question the reason why the government is condemning, and they can ask for more and there's no condemnation without compensation.
Right.
And that's the way the world works when you have conflicting interests. But here, King Achav just wanted to take this land, and it became it's a major story in the book of Kings about how this is a tremendously corrupt act. So and even you take you go back to the way kings behaved in the time that these texts were written. It's clear that kings had complete, absolute power.
More than that. If you look at, say, for Hosea, a bunch of murderous bastards.
Right.
The Jewish kings, who were bumping each other off.
Right. And that's why first of all, that's why I think we always have to be careful about saying that the Jews were always better. Many times the Jews are better. Sometimes not.
But the Torah, I followed every word carefully, and I love it because I could almost recite your spirituality. The Torah was realistic thousands of years before modernity. There are certain things you put up certain laws and they'll not be listened to. So the Torah moderated. I only wish that the rabbis of today will continue that search of moderation.
Thank you. I agree with everything you said. Let me just recant and I'll finish, and if somebody has any comments, I'll be happy to hear. I think that the problem the Torah had with
But God created man. And then you get into the issue of free will.
which is a different shiur. Okay. Next year. Okay. So just it's clear that the Torah is very skeptical about kings and kingdoms. And human nature.
So why did God create human nature like that?
Okay, we're not,
He can answer that.
Yeah. I mean, you can. Okay. The Torah touches a panic button when it says that you're allowed to have a king. The Torah is afraid that the king will be corrupt, will corrupt us. The Torah is afraid of the power. The Torah wants him to have the Sefer Torah with him all the time, because the Torah understands how dangerous absolute power is. The Torah, or at least the Talmud tries to limit that power. The Torah says that the king is not above the law. That the king can also be judged. That's the halacha. Malchei Beit David, he can judge, but he can also be judged. That nobody is above the law, which is a completely modern notion. For instance, the first Mishnah in Sanhedrin also says that if the Melech wants to go out to war, he has to consult with the Sanhedrin. He has to get the okay of the Sanhedrin. I'm not saying that there's a balance of that. What? I'm not saying that this is classical checks and balances, but if one wants to read modern notions of checks and balances and separation of powers, this is the beginning of separation of powers. So one problem the Torah has is completely practical. They knew how power corrupts and they were afraid of it, and in fact, our kings became corrupted. The other issue is that really the Torah understood that if a human being has absolute power and you're completely subjugated to him, your ability to be subjugated to God is completely limited. Now, people need, you ask, why do so many people in the world want these strong leaders? Why, after Stalin died in 1953, dozens of Russians committed suicide? They couldn't live without this great leader. You ask why so many millions of Germans would stand there and shout Heil Hitler. The Germans weren't a stupid people. They were enlightened. I think there's something very deep in human beings in which they're afraid of the freedom that they have, and they prefer to give it to some father figure, to some powerful person. He will decide for us. He will make the decisions for us. He will discharge me of my obligation to make decisions for myself. It's not easy being free. It's much easier when somebody tells you what to do all the time. Freedom has a tremendous burden. But Hashem is saying, if you want to be subservient to me, if you want to choose to be subservient to me, if you want to be a person of any kind of a spiritual meaning, then you have to be subservient to me and not to the king. Because once you're subservient to the king, then you lose something in your ability to be a free.
David HaMelech, he's the hero king of Israel. What do you have to say about
I'll say as following. And I'm touching a little bit on practical matters. First of all, he's considered a very righteous king. He had one terrible mishap. He had a terrible mishap with Bathsheba, and more than that, I think sending and you see how Chazal try to justify it because it was such a terrible act, and that's the way kings behaved then. I think that as modern people, nobody would be able to hold a leader who would do what he did with Bathsheba, and I think times were different. It's not for me to judge David HaMelech. And I think the amazing thing about David HaMelech is that immediately he realized his terrible mistake, and immediately he did tshuva, and he did, and he really, and the Tanakh says that he was ne'eman ka'avdi David. He's considered Eved Hashem. But since, thank God, we live in the 21st century, we cannot take norms from the times of antiquity and think that they're going to, I won't even say think that they're going to work today. Thank God, notions of modern democracy and limitations of power have become part of the Western world. And to think that we're going to go back, let me put it this way, I'll say it in a not nice way. To think that if we gave absolute power to the rabbinate today, to think that we'd be any better than the Catholic Church is just not understanding human nature. Anybody who knows what happens in the rabbinate today, what happens when people have absolute power, what happens when people cannot vote people out of office, it just corrupts. It becomes corrupt. So I think that as modern Jews, I can have tremendous respect for David HaMelech, and if he walked into the room here, I would kiss his feet. But that system of government was a terrible system of government. And thank God, things have evolved since then. So I'm willing to have a king, but the king has to be part of some kind of wider system, and especially a system in which nobody has absolute power.
And like as you said, Mashiach, and who we call Melech HaMashiach, you call him that.
That's fine.
It's a better point. David HaMelech.
Yeah. What? He said Chatati.
And he accepted.
And he accepted the pen, right.
And his kids were destroyed.
His kids were destroyed because when the father does things like that.
That's a message.
Right. Right.
And its basis
right.
is the most liberal
right.
document in history.
Right. But I'm saying that even Melech HaMashiach, the Talmud says that he has to have the Sanhedrin on his side. The Sanhedrin, theoretically, if I translate into, it's some kind of parliament. Okay? So we don't have to be afraid. The fact that in Isaiah we have a certain description of the Melech HaMashiach, who's he wants to lead a world of justice and peace, which is wonderful. And I'd love to have a leader like that. But it doesn't mean that we have to put all the wonderful things of modern democracy on the side because we have a Melech HaMashiach. Let him fit into that constellation. I'm not saying we won't have a Melech HaMashiach, but he can work into a modern constellation of the world, the few number of normal countries in which things don't work like they work in dictatorships. Toda raba.
Thank you very much.
It's not exactly fair to describe talking about obvious, to talk about obvious, and yet never give you